You're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada. I'm Jon Elmer. This is the Resistance Report for day 545 of this war. I'm reporting on April the 3rd. As Nora said in her excellent news introduction, this has now been 1 month since the siege began. 33rd day today of total siege, no food, no medical supplies, no fuel, the longest siege of the war. What we're watching right now is not a battle. It is a violation of the ceasefire by Israel that's agreed upon and guaranteed by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. This is not a fight. It's not a face-to-face fight. There has not been a single engagement between the resistance and the Israeli forces in a face-to-face fight. It's cowardly attacks. It's the massacres that we've been talking about on this program for the previous hour and a half. And that's the situation as it is now. Again, I said this last week, it could change at any moment. But right now, those face-to-face confrontations are not happening. This is a war against civilians. There's been more than 100 airstrikes over the last day and a half. It began with 50 airstrikes overnight in the Rafah area. We can maybe pull up the map of Gaza because it's happening all across Gaza, but there's a bit of a focus for sure right now on the south, as Nora indicated. But if we look at the map that we're looking at right now, okay, in the zoom in here, you can see the main area of the evacuation orders by the Israeli military. Those evacuation orders, as has happened all throughout this war, the evacuation orders happen at the same time as the civilian massacres are happening. There's not a period of time that's a grace period to allow people to leave. As disgusting as evacuations are, forced displacement is, there's no grace period for that. The attacks are happening as people are leaving. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Jonathan Whitall, said that he's in Gaza and said that he was seeing people shot in the back as they were leaving Rafah from these evacuation notices. 50 airstrikes overnight targeting just the Rafah area is an operational tempo that is as high as at any point in the last year. So we're talking about significant engagements from the air, cowardly attacks targeting civilians to displace the population. We can see on this map when you cut off the Philadelphia corridor is where the Israeli forces have control. You can see the Rafah crossing where people are supposed to be exiting for to get urgent medical care that was agreed upon and guaranteed by the United States and Egypt in the ceasefire agreement, are supposed to exit out the Rafah crossing at the bottom. That is not happening right now. And then further down at the bottom of the screen there, cut off, but right at the edge is Kerem Shalom. That's the crossing where the aid is supposed to come in. And according to the Gaza ministry, the occupation has blocked 18,600 aid trucks at this point, in addition to 1,550 trucks carrying fuel, diesel, gasoline, and cooking gas. That goes on top of the targeting attacks of the shelters, and Israelis have bombed more than 60 soup kitchens and aid distribution centers, putting them out of service. So that is all happening in violation of the ceasefire. These are ceasefire violations that so far the resistance has not violated the ceasefire in the way that the Israelis are. It has not tripped a full-scale battle. If we look at, so the map that you're looking at there, 97% of that area south of Khan Yunis is a complete no-go zone for the population. UN OCHA, again, they said 64% of Gaza's total area is inaccessible right now, and more than 100,000 people fled from Rafah alone in a 24-hour period, and again, under fire. And Nora reported on the mass graves of the paramedics and of the Red Crescent paramedics and civil defense that happened on the eastern edge of Rafah. People are not getting access to the Israeli military. This is all standoff fighting at this point. If we take a look at the next map, you can see the evacuation notice. This is this sick map that the Israelis have that marks in something like 700 different blocks for evacuations. But you can also just see in the way that this map is laid out by the Israelis how much is already the buffer zone. The shaded areas on the edges of Gaza are already a buffer zone, a no-go zone, completely flattened in this area. And so that's the evacuation notice from Rafah. These are war crimes. So these maps that the Israeli military puts out, that they think that they're avoiding war crimes charges with these maps should be shown for what they are: the forced displacement of the population intentionally with no military purpose. This is the most extensive evacuation announcement since the return to war. And if we look at the next map, Netanyahu announced yesterday, I reported last week that there was no military orders to the troops, that they didn't have clear orders of what they're doing. Netanyahu yesterday, this is a map from Army Radio, IDF Army Radio, and this is Netanyahu's he wants to establish a second finger through here. This is the Morag settlement, is a spot where there used to be an Israeli settlement that split Khan Yunis from Rafah in the south and allowed access to 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, which is the area on the coast there, which much of which is now known as Mawasi now. Mawasi was previously just a small area, but the entire area that the Israelis push people to, they're calling Mawasi. That was previously 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, a settlement that was uprooted in 2005 during the disengagement. And this is just Israel reestablishing these finger plans, the 5 finger plans I've talked about a number of times over the last year and a half on the show. They go back to the 1970s, and particularly Ariel Sharon. But the goal is to create fingers through the territory to break up the contiguity of the Palestinian population. It's essentially Zionism in a nutshell. You put in military installations into the middle of Palestinian civilian areas. And then later, after you've established the military base, you bring civilians in, you civilianize it to give it sort of an air of legitimacy. But the goal is to cut up Arab contiguity and to create Israeli Jewish contiguity in the land as well. So they're using this now corridor that was established when I worked in Gaza for a number of years. This was a corridor that was difficult to pass through. There's a checkpoint. It was difficult for people from Rafah to get anywhere north. There's multiple checkpoints up between Khan Yunis and the middle camps area. So these are not military plans that are new. They're just essentially the Israelis moving into areas that are largely at this point depopulated and destroyed. So this is the Morag corridor. Netanyahu is calling it Philadelphia B. And so there, again, I can't tell you any military effect of having that corridor, but it's going to be devastating for the civilian population. If we look at the next map, you can see further, this is in the north, and you can see the buffer zone in the north is even more ridiculous, cutting off. And this is how you get numbers like, just over half of the Gaza Strip's territory is no-go zones. You can see it on that map directly all across the border there and through the top. That's an evacuation notice in Beit Hanun. Beside it in the north, above that red, is Beit Lahia. They also got an evacuation notice. Just further down, there was an evacuation notice in Shujaiya today on the eastern edge of Gaza City. And earlier this week, there was evacuation notices along Zaytun and Tel El-Hawa, which are the southern edge of Gaza City. So just trapping people into smaller and smaller areas, not fighting. These are not battles at this point. They're just squeezing the territory from the outside. And so far as the resistance, let's look at number 5. The resistance is also, at this point, so far it's been Saraya al-Quds carrying out the resistance, which is, I showed a couple of Qassam rocket attacks on Tel Aviv, but these nearly daily rocket attacks have been carried out by Soraya al-Quds, which is the way that it often works in Gaza. Soraya al-Quds will carry out these operations at a time when Qassam is, for various reasons, not carrying out operations. In this particular case, it's because they're committed to the ceasefire that they agreed and signed to, and that the United States and Israel and Egypt and Qatar signed to as well. So these are ceasefire violations by the Israelis that the Palestinians so far have not matched on the ground their violations. They've just sent messages through these rocket launches towards the Gaza envelope. And I'll show you another one in a minute here towards an IDF airbase that's carrying out the massacres in Gaza. So we've seen a number of these rocket attacks, standoff fire, which is what the Israelis are doing as well. The Israelis are not fighting with their tanks on the ground. They're firing from the buffer zone into population centers. They're using their planes. And so this is just the Palestinian version of that. This is standoff fire, essentially message sending, both that they're still here, but that they are able to fire rockets, homemade rockets. You're looking at Gaza-made rockets fired from buried rocket launchers that are very difficult for the Israelis to defeat, and the Palestinians have this rocket capacity. I've said it a number of times that it's not a good way to judge whether the resistance is still strong, because they're probably holding back their rockets at this point, because this is a war of attrition, and I don't think anyone can trust this ceasefire that's going on at this point right now. If we look at the next slide, Tamara, you can see one of these launchers that was found. This is an Israeli Defense Forces release. This is the kind of stuff where they're massacring children by the hundreds. Their military is releasing these field reports showing their military accomplishments. If you look at the left there, you can see that's the type of rocket launcher that we just saw in that Soraya al-Quds video, buried in sand, makeshift launchers. And this is the military accomplishments that Israel is taking credit for to their people, while they're killing more than 1,000 people, as Nora reported. A significant number, more than a third of them, are children. If we look at the next one, this is Soraya al-Quds launching against Hatzarim Air Base. This is the air base in southern Israel that fighter jets attack in Gaza leave from. You can see, again, makeshift launchers. There's no way to stop the Palestinians from creating this, even in the devastation that Israel has wrought on the Gaza Strip. So these are signs that the resistance are still here, but by and large, so far, they're adhering to the ceasefire. And I think that there's a lot of statements from Hamas that show that they are committed to that ceasefire. And I think we're going to talk about that more in the discussion later on in the show, because there's been a number of developments on the ceasefire front. But we haven't returned to open war. What we've returned to is much like the October 2023 period, where you have rocket fire out of Gaza and civilian massacres by the Israelis. And so far, that's what we're seeing. There was a couple of operations, possibly just one operation that was claimed. The Israelis said that one of their armored vehicles drove over an IED, and Soraya al-Quds said earlier this week that they had pre-planted that IED, and it was likely triggered by a pressure plate. So that's the only example that we've seen. And we know through the buffer zones throughout the war that the resistance has the ability to attack the buffer zones. So it appears that it's still, again, this could change at any moment, but it appears a decision that they're making to stick to the ceasefire and to open the borders back up and resume the prisoner exchange and guarantees to end the war for the Israelis. Also this week, there was a conference. I'm going to talk about Yemen next, but I just want to bridge that with there was a conference in Yemen this week, Palestine conference, and on Quds Day, which was earlier this week, Abu Hamza, who was assassinated in the March 18th, the restart of the war in full on by the Israelis, 80 airstrikes in 10 minutes. He was assassinated, and he recorded the speech before he was assassinated. So they released this speech to the Yemeni population, which was quite an intense moment. And the speech was really interesting. The whole speech is great. We don't have time to play the whole thing, but he talked about a number of things about Yemen that were really interesting that I'm going to read from that speech here. He said, the Yemeni presence on the battlefield has been a critical benchmark position, imposing a naval blockade in the Red Sea in addition to qualitative military operations against the occupier. We draw the world's attention to the remarkable popular demonstrations in Yemen's public squares, where the free peoples of Yemen's voices rang out and served as strong motivation for the Yemeni armed forces who persevere with unwavering resolve. So linking the demonstrations on the street in Yemen to the Yemeni support for the Palestinians. And he also said this, he said, we pay great tribute to Abdel Malik Badruddin al-Houthi, who stood with us in the Palestinian resistance. We listened attentively to his detailed speeches regarding the battle, its trajectory, and its ramifications, as if he were present with us on the front lines of the war in the heart of Gaza. So an interesting note that al-Houthi speeches, weekly speeches, he would give the speech on Thursdays, and then the massive demonstrations in Yemen were on Fridays. And Abu Hamza wanted everyone in Yemen to know that they, in the resistance, while they were in their battle positions, were listening to those speeches. And I thought that was an interesting note and an interesting bridge to the second part of this discussion.